Now, in order to get a marriage that sizzles, you need to be a person that can do that. And so whether you're married or whether you're single, we're gonna talk this morning a very practical way of how you can build a marriage that sizzles. Now, you could be in the middle of a marriage relationship, or that could be in your distant or near future, but the work starts right now. This is maybe the most practical sermon that we're gonna teach in this entire sermon series. It started with me doing extensive research. I looked at every one of our Cypress members, and I searched deep and wide looking for the perfect marriage. And here they are. No, I'm just teasing. There's not one. You got real nervous, didn't you? You thought, yes, don't make me stand up because I would be lying. There's not one. So I want everyone that's in the middle of a marriage relationship right now just to breathe easy and relax, because you think that everyone around you is in this perfect, blissful marital relationship. And those of you who are single think, there's just no way I can obtain that. That's because it is not obtainable. There is no such thing as a perfect marriage. You cannot take an imperfect man, sinful, an imperfect woman, sinful, and unite them together and get a perfect marriage. It does not work. So when we received kind of the sermon topics, I looked down and it said pulling weeds. I thought that is an amazingly practical analogy of what we need to do to build marriages that sizzle. Pulling weeds. So I have been studying this week weed pulling. Now, I've done some serious investigation on things that infiltrate a marriage, that pop up in a marriage, that contaminate a marriage, that ruin a marriage. And I can tell you right now, my computer thinks I am in the worst marriage ever. Every other story that pops up voluntarily is things that'll build a successful marriage. Did you marry the wrong person? All of these things that can't, because I've been studying this, and I have looked at so many things. In fact, on Friday, I thought, maybe I just practically ought to look at what it means to pull a weed, an actual weed. And I was watching this Australian gardener because it just sounded cool. And it was amazing. They gave a definition of weeds. They said it's not necessarily, it has to be this type or that type. A weed is, and they gave a definition. I thought, I'm going to use that. So I looked at dictionary.com, because if it says it on the internet, it's got to be true, right? This is the definition that dictionary.com gives for a weed. A weed is any undesirable or troublesome plant, especially one that grows profusely where it is not wanted. Wow. What an incredible definition of things that pop up in marriage, that pop up in any relationship. Could be a friendship, a dating relationship, siblings, parents, kids, anything that pops up that is not wanted, that grows profusely, and that is undesirable. And when you think about what a weed is in a relationship, it is that. It doesn't have to necessarily be some negative thing. It can be something positive, but if it's undesired, if it's not planted, not planned, and it pops up and takes away from what you're trying to do, that's considered a weed. And so this morning, very practically, I want us to look at relationships that need weeding, that need us to pull weeds. And I want to just, very practically, I want to look at some facts about weeds. First of all, weeds grow quickly. You don't have to nurture them. They just pop up and they grow. Second thing, they grow relentlessly. In fact, out of all of the joys of home ownership, pulling weeds may be at the bottom of my list. I cannot stand pulling weeds. Why? Because they grow in my yard, probably not yours, in my yard relentlessly. I pull them, they grow quickly back. Weeds grow without planting or planning. You don't plant weeds. You don't sit back and go, okay, I want some broadleaf here, I want some clover here. They just show up. And it's the same is true about marriage. You don't plan on the weeds that will destroy a relationship. You don't plan on something growing up or sprouting up in the middle of your relationship that's going to cause frustration and disharmony in a marital relationship. You don't plan it. Finally, weeds take over if not pulled. In fact, if you don't pay attention, the weeds will absolutely take over. You may have some plants there that you planted that you're trying to water and fertilize and you want them to grow. But if you don't take care of the weeds that are growing around them, all of a sudden you won't see it. In fact, I have a picture right here of a infested garden that right there, that may look like your backyard. It's not yours, I promise. I didn't take a picture of your backyard. That is what happens when we don't take care of weeds. They can grow as tall as you are if they're not taken care of. Our desire is this. We want to grow relationships that look like this. This is our backyard. No, it's not. It's not our backyard. I have a life, so. But the amazing thing is when we think about weeds and we think about the desired end product, that person, that homeowner still has to pull weeds. That homeowner can't say everything looks beautiful, I can take a month off. And there's a few things about pulling weeds that if this is the marriage we want, controlling weeds, 4 things. First of all, pulling weeds is hard work. It's thankless. It is absolutely not a lot of fun. When I asked you how your beautiful Saturday was, you didn't say, oh, it was wonderful, I pulled weeds all day long. It is a thankless, difficult job. Marriage is hard work. Relationships are hard work. So stop making excuses not to roll up your sleeve and work at building a marriage that sizzles, pouring into relationships. Instead, you just sit back and watch the weeds grow. Okay, second, weeds have to be pulled consistently. You have to constantly be in those beds pulling the weeds because they're going to grow relentlessly. They're going to come back and they're going to come back and they're going to come back. And if you don't consistently pull them, then you look up one day and all of a sudden your bed is unrecognizable. Your marriage is in trouble. Third thing, you must pull up the roots. You have to dig down and work to make sure you pull up the root. Otherwise, that weed is just going to grow back quickly, like days, it'll be back. And then fourth and finally, the sooner you pull the weed, the better. In fact, if you let a weed continue to grow, not only does it grow stronger roots, but it actually spreads and germinates around it, and it will grow thicker out wide as well as deeper and taller. So the best way when you're studying how to pull roots, the best way to pull weeds is to pull them as quickly as you see them. When you see it sprout up, you pull it. There is tremendous practical parallels to everything I just said about gardening, and I'm not talking about gardening. I'm talking about growing relationships that honor the Lord, that bring satisfaction and joy, that bring so much pleasure. When you have 2 people who are willing to put in the work, 2 people who are willing to pour in to the foundation of a relationship, of a marriage that will sizzle. Now, when we think about the parallels, the transition from gardening to working on relationships, I want us to think about the ABCs. I want it to be easy to remember, and I want us to think about the ABCs of weeding your marriage. The A is this: always be working. Always be working. There's a great passage of scripture, Proverbs chapter 24. Proverbs is the most practical book in the Bible. It's just how do you live a successful life? What are some ways that you deal with people, that you deal with work ethic, that you deal with sin that comes up? It's a very practical book. And Proverbs 24 says this, starting in verse 30, I passed by a field of a sluggard. If you don't know what a sluggard is, someone who's lazy. And by the vineyard of a man lacking sense. And behold, it was completely overgrown with thistles, weeds. Its surface was covered with nettles, weeds. And its stone wall was broken down. When I saw, I reflected upon it. I looked and received instructions, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. Then your poverty will come as a robber and your want like an armed man. Here's what Solomon, the wisest man that ever lived, says about weeds. If you're lazy and you don't work, the weeds will overtake everything. And if we are always working on those weeds, always pulling, always building, always working on maintaining a marriage that will thrive, It is hard work. It is a thankless job. And we, as Christ followers, need to honor God by pouring into our marriages instead of taking the day off. We're always having to pull weeds. In fact, Tiffany and I went on a vacation back at the end of July, and it was long for our sense of what a vacation should be. So before we did a lot of work on the house and the yard to try to get it prepared to be gone for 11 or 12 days. And there is a bed in our house that has roses in it and a couple other things, but mainly roses. And I don't know what the deal with this bed is, but it grows weeds like, I mean, if I could sell weeds, we would be millionaires just from this one bed. And I worked for about an hour making sure that every weed was gone from that bed. And all you could see was the roses. It could take all the nutrients, all the water. It would be perfect. We got back 2 weeks later. It was as if I didn't do a thing. Why? Because they grow relentlessly. And you know what I had to do? 2 weeks coming off vacation, get back to the same bed, keep working, keep at it, be consistent, always pulling weeds. If you want a marriage, if you want any relationship that glorifies God, that brings you joy and satisfaction, it takes work. We cannot be like Proverbs 24, the lazy sluggard that just looks at the field and says, now get to it tomorrow. When we see weeds, get to work. When we have a marriage that you have a husband and a wife that are both dedicated and motivated to say when something pops up that is undesirable, that we don't want in our relationship, we're gonna work at it. That will be a marriage that will honor God and that will sizzle. Always be ready to work. Always be weeding your garden. Always be working. No vacations, no days off from you building a marriage that sizzles. Always be working. The B is be quick and thorough. Be quick and thorough. I told you that you pull a weed quickly because if you don't, it grows deeper roots and it spreads. That is issues in any relationship. When you don't deal with things immediately, they grow, they spread. Little issues become big issues. One issue becomes 12 issues when we don't take care of them. Passage of scripture that I really want us to focus on is Ephesians chapter 4. I'm gonna read a few verses there. This is Paul's advice dealing with people, but I'm gonna apply it to our relationships, especially our marriage relationships. 4:22 says that in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside of the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lust of deceit. Laying aside, pulling weeds. That you look at those old things, that old selfishness, the old lust, the old dishonesty, and you pull those. You lay them aside, we're pulling them. And that, verse 23, and that you, being renewed in the spirit of your mind, and that you put on the new self, you're planting, you're watering, you're fertilizing the good stuff, which is in the likeness of God, has been created in righteousness and holiness of truth. Therefore, laying aside, pulling the weeds, laying aside falsehood, speak truth, each one of you, with his neighbor, with his spouse, for we are members of one another. Be angry, and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity. Those last two verses really drive home the point, that second point, that you be quick and be thorough. It says be angry, but don't let the sun go down on your anger. And when you let the sun go down on your anger, you give the devil an opportunity. One translation says a foothold for that devil to step in and to climb into your relationship. Paul says anger is a real thing. It's an issue. You can be angry, but resolve that conflict. Let go of that anger and fix the issue. Pull the weed that is causing frustration in your relationship. Be angry, but don't let the sun go down on your anger. That's why we tell people before you go to bed, resolve that conflict. Have it out. It may mean that you lose an hour of sleep, but you will sleep better knowing the fact that that weed is pulled and that that conflict is resolved. And that you deal with those weeds quickly and thoroughly, that you pull them up by the root. You don't just cover them up. You don't just simply glance over them. You don't do what my neighbor does. He takes care of weeding his beds with his weed eater. Now, I know it's called a weed eater, but it's not really meant for that. It's an edger. He just takes those weeds and mulch everywhere, the weeds, they're gone for about a day. That's not being thorough. How do we pull weeds? By the root. How do we pull weeds? By working hard, by digging down and pulling up the root of the issue. When you have a weed in your relationship, don't simply just chop off the cover so you can go to bed and sleep. You dig up the root and you deal with it and you resolve that conflict so that you can build a relationship, a marriage that sizzles. It takes work. Be thorough, be quick. As soon as that problem arises, you take care of it. That is a key to having a relationship that will bring you joy and satisfaction and honor God. It's a key to having something that truly is going to honor the Lord. Always be working. Be quick and be thorough. And then finally, communicate to build. Communicate to build. When we communicate, you can destruct or construct. We want to communicate to build. In fact, in my studies, I went ahead and tried to write down anything that could get in the way of a marriage relationship. And all of those articles, some of them were secular, some of them were sacred or Christian. Some of them were my own personal research. I asked the staff, give me something that gets in the way of your marriage, that pops up, that's unwanted, that frustrates you and gets in the way of you having a marriage that sizzles. All of these things, the list was so long that I couldn't even, it took 3 columns on my brainstorming little notebook that I write down. And I listed some of them. These are some of the weeds. And how many of these deal with communicating? How many of these are solved with communicating? How many of these are resolved when you just simply communicate to build? These are some of the weeds that people mention, whether an article or person that I asked. Priorities, selfishness, wrong company, flirting, jealousy, busyness, bitterness, unforgiveness, nagging, criticism, dishonesty, complacency, stonewalling, silence, social media, indifference, lack of trust, centering everything on the kids, finances. That was about 1/4 of what I had written down. But this morning isn't about recognizing the weeds. You can do that on your own. Because what is a weed in your marriage may be totally different than someone else. You know what those issues are. If you don't, pray about them. Take your spouse to dinner and say, what are the weeds in our marriage right now that we need to work, that we need to pull, and that we need to communicate? The issue is most every one of those deals, most every one of those weeds are resolved by communication that builds. It also, communications can be one of the weeds. Sarcasm, criticism, silence, lack of communication. Look at what Paul continues in Ephesians chapter 4 with this. 4:29 says, let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word that is good for edification, that's building up, according to the need of the moment, so that it will give grace to those who hear. Communication is key. You're always ready to pull. You're being quick and thorough, but how do you pull? By communicating. This is what hurts me. This is why I'm frustrated. This is something I'm working on. Help me work on this together. And it says right here how to differentiate between communication that destroys and communication that builds. It says, no unwholesome talk. That doesn't simply mean curse words. It means words that are meant to destroy. Sarcastic, overly critical, words that you know will add fuel to the fire of frustration and not put out that fire. And it says, but only those that really build up, edify the person. How are your words in your relationships? How are your words in your marriage building up your spouse? How are they lifting them up and edifying them and building them up to be the husband or the wife that you want them to be? And it says to give grace to meet the need. There are times where truth is needed, but there are times where a loving, comforting word, a word of encouragement, a word of support, a word of unconditional love is exactly what Ephesians 4:29 says. but only such a word as it is good for the edification according to the need of the moment. It means that if you're going to have a garden, if you're going to have a marriage that sizzles and a weed-free garden, it means that you ask yourself, what word is needed in this situation? Is it a word of comfort? Is it a word of encouragement? Is it a word of challenge? What is the word in this situation? And I'm gonna deliver that word with love and gentleness. I'm gonna deliver that word as one who wants to pull the weeds and stop the frustration and the things in my marriage that will tear it down. And I want my communication to build up my spouse. That is communicating. Proverbs 15:1. If you don't know it, memorize Ephesians 4:29, memorize Proverbs 15:1. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. And when you see weeds popping up and there's a situation and circumstances and frustration in a relationship, you just ask yourself, when I'm looking at this weed, this issue, what will make it grow and what will pull it up by its roots? Proverbs tells us a gentle answer pulls up that weed. A harsh word waters that weed and gives it sunlight so it'll grow and spread and be a bigger issue than it was when it started. A gentle answer, the way that we communicate, the way that we speak to one another will either build a marriage that sizzles or will let the weeds grow like wild. Now, when you think about the weeds, we started with the definition of it's something that grows where it's not wanted. And there can be good things that take away from the water and the sunlight and the nutrients in the soil. There can be good things that will spread. We have an elm tree. It's a great tree, but it tries to spread everywhere and anywhere it can take root. It's a great thing to grow, but not in my flower bed. And it's almost impossible to pull. We have some good things in our relationships that are absolutely taken away from the sunlight, the water, and the nutrients in the soil that are starving your marital relationship because you're putting forth your effort in the wrong things. One of the first things and one of the most consistent things that when I asked what the weeds were, priorities or busyness. Our schedules in our chaotic world can be a weed that runs rampant in the flower bed of your marriage. Our scheduling and our chaos of the kids. Some of us right now, and there is a season that we have to be parents and we have to pour a lot of effort into our kids. But prioritize how much. I can tell you that if you ask kids when they're 25 years old, do you wish your parents would have given you more coaching when you were 8 to make you that next major leaguer or the best tumbler or the best whatever or the scholarship athlete or the straight A students? Or do you wish they would have loved one another and modeled to you what a godly marriage looks like? When they're 25 and out of eligibility and looking for a spouse, they need a biblical example of a marriage that sizzles. Stop pouring forth all of your effort in your kids. Make sure that they see you model what it means to be a godly, loving, sacrificial husband. Make sure they see what it looks like to be a godly wife who loves and respects her husband. That is the best lesson. It's better than batting practice or dribbling or cheering or whatever you're spending way too much time and money on right now. They need to see marriages that sizzle. Because what our country needs is not the next Michael Jordan. What our country needs are solid marriages that build solid families, that build solid communities, that build solid states that will make this nation head in the right direction. And it starts with prioritizing what you need to plant, what you need to water, what you need to fertilize. That marriage relationship, next to your relationship with Jesus, is the most important relationship in your life. Remember, parents, your kids are on borrow. There is a time, that's why it's called the nest. It's meant to be emptied. And you're supposed to send them off, raise and release your kids. But that marriage relationship is till death do you part. That marriage that sizzles gets better with time. That marriage that honors God is one that prioritizes your marital relationship over work, over recreation, and even over parenting. That is planting a garden that you can sit back and say, you know what? There's still maintenance. There's still weed pulling. There's still some work to be done. But that's one that I can have company. That's one that I can invite people over and go, let's sit outside instead of being embarrassed at what your weeds look like, what your beds look like. When you walk into church, we have good marriages, we have great marriages, and we have struggling marriages. We have marriages that are so frustrating right now. We have great marriages. Both of them have weeds. Both of them need attention. Both of them take work. But if you have a struggling marriage right now, the greatest news is with work, swallow your pride, seek help, seek a mentor couple, seek God's word, sit down and say, what are the first weeds that we can pull to getting control back over our marriage? How can we build a marriage that sizzles? And if you hear only one thing, the work, the effort, the sacrifice, the swallowing the pride, when you put in the work, it is worth it. It's worth it to have a marriage that honors God, that brings you satisfaction and that sizzles. It's worth it to put in the work to have a marriage that brings you the joy that only Christ in the center of a marriage can bring. We need those marriages. And we need people who will put in the work, who will pull the weeds, who will communicate and build solid marriages that will build the solid families that our community needs. Will you put in the work?